Hey folks, Steve here with a special review video for you today. We're going to be taking a look at The Deadly Woods, Battle of the Bulge, a game designed by Ted Raicer and published by Revolution Games. This is a game that is technically a part of the Dark series due to branding decisions. It does not have the Dark name, but games like The Dark Valley, The Dark Sands, and now more recently The Dark Summer are in relation to this game that goes by the Deadly naming convention, the Deadly Woods. And as you can imagine, this is a game covering the Battle of the Bulge and is, in typical Dark Series fashion, a chit pull game. Now, I have completed a solo campaign playthrough that you can watch on the channel here. I played through the entirety of the game in relative detail, explaining the game as I go. And while that playthrough did have the occasional rules issue along the way or me forgetting something, I'd say that my game experience is pretty authentic. Whatever little issues I may have encountered in terms of getting something wrong as I was playing didn't have a huge impact on the overall game, and I think still gives a pretty good feel for that. So if you would like to see things in much greater detail and you want to see the game in action, you can go watch those videos. But we will have this review in the same format as the usual, which is this intro. We'll take a closer look at the game components and the way the game works, and then we'll finish off the video with my final thoughts and ultimately my conclusions for this particular game. So hopefully this position of the camera in relation to me speaking works a lot better for the audio. I know folks had some issues with my audio because I was too far away from the camera. Hopefully me being closer helps keep the audio a little better for you guys. So let me know in the comments section how this works. But yeah, so we'll take a closer look at the game. If you want to dig a little bit deeper into this particular product, like I said, the other series can give you a much deeper look. We'll try to keep it higher level for the rest of the video. So let's cut it over to the more detailed look at the game mechanics and components, so you guys get a closer look at the product itself. Okay, so yeah, let's talk about components. The game is available from Revolution Games in two formats. One as a sort of folio bag format, and one as the boxed format, the boxed edition being ever so slightly more expensive because you're purchasing a box. I quite like the box, honestly. I like the box art. I think I tend to prefer to have games in a box than a bag if I have a choice. But your mileage may vary there. Everything fits back into the box just fine. This has to do with the fact that the map itself is paper. Now, for my playthrough, I put my standard sheet of plexiglass on top of the paper map. That may be something, if you don't like paper maps, maybe that's a problem. But at this point, I almost prefer paper maps because it allows me to more easily put the plexiglass on top of it, and it is pretty stable from that point on. But yes, it is a paper map. The interesting thing that comes with the game, and was sort of a surprise when I first looked at the game itself, was that there is a setup map that is used to assist in the setup of the game. And so you have this sort of fold out. It's almost, it's an extra map of itself. And it basically equates to the right side of the map and helps you do the setup, where in the top left of a counter will be either a number or a letter and a number. A letter and the number tells you that it's a reinforcement, and depending on what letter it is, it's going to depend on what turn that unit's going to come in. But otherwise, that number equates to a position on the map for startup. So if the counter has in the top left the number 1, then that means it's going to go into the 1 position, 4023 hex or 3823 hex. Now, they might have been able to do the same sort of thing by just putting a hex number on there, but it keeps the counters a little more clean to have this number code designation method of setting it up. So it helped a good bit, and it helped order the units. So rather than just trying to look at all the different hex codes and organizing that, being able to say, okay, here's a number one counter, here's a number two counter. What you could do is you could line them up in increasing order, and that would just tell you along this front line where those units would go. It actually worked much better than I thought it would. I wasn't sure if it was going to be needed, but I kind of saw the beauty in how that helped you set up, and it's something that maybe wouldn't always be needed for certain war games to help with setup, but I found it to be a pretty useful convention. I hope to see it in more games, but yeah, it does mean printing off either a big sheet like that, or maybe spending some time, or some of the pages of a rule book, uh, providing that readout. So I don't know. It worked here, and maybe it'll work in other places. The counters themselves are pretty good counters, I would say, just in terms of quality. They are uh, brown core. I did clip my counters, so that was something I didn't really feel like I had to do, but I did prefer it because they just look so good with my clipper once everything got done. So they tend to look very nice. The counters have a nice balance of being not too flashy with a bunch of oddball colors. They're going to be your standard, gray for the Germans, green for the Americans, but everything is very clear and the print is very clear. So the strength and movement factors are clear. The designations for what unit it is are clear. So on the right side of the NATO counter, you have what regiment this is, so the 423rd, and we know that it's part of the 212th formation there, which is to the left of the NATO symbol. So everything is very clear from that perspective. There's really not a whole lot of guesswork. Uh, an American unit, by comparison, also has some special things where the top right of the counter has a core symbol, and that tells you which allied corps that unit belongs to. And ultimately, that has to do with the way asset markers are used. This game does use asset markers, which are sort of, within certain usage constraints, things you can throw into a combat to provide extra combat factors. So, for instance, here is a German artillery marker. It has the 5th Panzer Army designation on it, or you can see it's set for the 5th Panzer Army. What this means is that units that are eligible based on their location, which would be whether or not they're part of the 5th Panzer Army, can have 4 combat factors added to a combat. The Germans can use theirs once per turn, so they only get a few, and they can only use them at one time per turn, which isn't a whole lot. Now, by comparison, the Allies have a much greater artillery advantage, but it works a little bit differently. So here's an American artillery marker. The Allies eventually have more artillery counters, period, but there is some asymmetry here where these artillery markers, these asset markers, can be used once per action round. And what this means in the context of a chit pull game is every time there's a new chit pulled, these guys refresh. So the Allied artillery advantage is actually quite immense once they actually get the reinforcements. So you start with this one, but over time you get additional artillery markers as reinforcements. So there are not artillery counters on the map, but instead these asset markers. The other restriction is those artillery markers share a core picture in the top right. So in order to use it, a unit from that core has to be a part of the combat. So there is a little bit of thinking, where are your artillery assets even usable? You can only throw in so many per combat, and you need to make sure that it's of the appropriate core, which, depending on how your units are organized on the map, you may have gotten a lot of convoluted stacks of units all belonging from different core, which has some advantages and disadvantages. The overall configuration of the components is pretty strong. So I'll say that from just the basic reading of the materials, the player aid sheet that comes with the game. This is the first basic one. is quite nice. It's very clear. Everything is communicated well. The back side of it is acts as the front cover of the folio edition. Someone pointed that out to me in the comments. Since I didn't buy the folio edition, it didn't occur to me that was the case. So, this is what faces the outside of your baggie, and on the back side is this first player aid sheet. There are two, at least in the boxed edition, other charts, this being a standard combat results table and terrain effects chart, and on the back side there is the action chit summary, which tells you what each of the action chits in the game do. If you're unfamiliar with chit pull, the basic idea is that at any given time, you're going to be pulling from a opaque container, a cup, some markers that will govern whose action it is and what they can do. And it's going to be a grab bag of different things. So here's just a few examples where you could pull a chit and it says move on one side. So you say, okay, I'm going to do a movement, or you could use the combat side and say, I'm going to choose to do a combat. Sometimes you have a choice. Sometimes the action chits that you draw are more constrained. Some are specialty chits that allow you to do a lot of cool stuff, but maybe in a narrow area. And you don't necessarily know what chit will be pulled from the cup. You can have a pretty good idea based on what chits are still in the cup at any given time. But ultimately, you can't guarantee things are going to play out in a particular order. It forces you as a player to think about what could happen, what you want to happen, and what might happen that you really don't want to happen. And at each increment, as each chit is pulled, the situation on the battlefield will thus change. And you have to continually be trying to figure out what you're capable of doing and what you have to do it with. And I find that to be a really attractive part of the Dark series, of chit pull in general. There are other games that use chit pull that are not the Dark series or Deadly series. But it is a hallmark of the series, and it works really well, particularly for solitaire, because it means you do not have to be, worrying about what you're doing in reaction to yourself from turn to turn to turn, because it's I go, you go, I go, you go. Here, you can't just guarantee anything. So when that chit comes up, you have to start thinking, what can I do right now with that chit in the units on the board? As it relates to the rest of the components, I will say, and this will be something I touch upon in the conclusion of this video, ultimately, there are a lot of special rules. In particular, there's a lot of special rules for turns 1 through 3 and 4, so much so that I had to print off a special turn reminder sheet from Board Game Geek, and I did some editing on it to try to make it easier to use, and I still could do a better job of it. It's a shame to need something like that, but I do think you're almost required to do it. There are enough special rules that could be missed in the operation of the game that could affect the game quite a bit if you didn't do them or you didn't do them properly. And that, someone took the effort to create a turn reminder sheet is great, and you can use that. It can help your game experience right away, but you have to go print that off yourself. I really think that the game would benefit in future printings if they had a turn reminder summary sheet included as a separate player aid. You only need one copy, um, and I think it would go a long way to making the game just a little bit more functional. Those special turns are going to turn people off, I think, ultimately, but they're not so bad. It's just you want to make sure you know what ones matter on the turn that you're playing, and verifying that and then continuing on. The other thing is the as available terrain and combat chart doesn't include everything that matter for combat. So, for instance, this player aid sheet has combat results table. You say, okay, that's great, that's good, and you got terrain effects, which is good, and that tells you how terrain can affect combat. But there are other things that influence what shifts you get for combat. You can shift the odds column further down to the left or further on to the right, depending on special circumstances. This, yet again, is something that someone created their own player aid sheet for, or player card, where they talk about these other shifts. So armor attacking in the clear, they get an extra shift. If you do not have divisional integrity, then you lose a shift and stuff like that. That is in the rules. It's not hard to remember for a while, but you'd really rather have a reference to make sure that you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's. And this content is not in a player aid sheet, but it's not that much text that it couldn't be added, or that, some of this information here on this sheet just by itself is not so much information that it couldn't be leveraged. One thing to keep in mind is that the actual rule book itself, which works just fine, it comes out to be 23 pages. The rules are laid out fine and are relatively easy to read. On the back side is the action chit availability chart. So this tells you what chits are available turn to turn. It's not a dedicated player aid sheet, and I ended up just printing off a copy of that one page just so I could look at the rule book and look at the action chit availability chart at the same time rather. So what does that really mean? I think it boils down to a recommendation that, in future printings of this game, whether we're talking like a second printing or some enhanced printing that occurs at some point in the future, I think the game would really benefit from having just one more player aid sheet or a modification of the existing player aid sheets, so that you manage to get the combat results table and the terrain effects chart and the additional shift definitions laid out clearly for the players. And then either on the back of that or on another sheet or some additional thing, a nice summary of all the special turn stuff. Now, that might increase the cost of the game because you're basically adding yet another card sheet to the game. But honestly, I think it's totally worth it for the purchaser, for the person buying the game, to have that. If it adds a buck or something, or a couple bucks to the game, I mean, I don't know what the economy of that looks like ultimately, but I do think the game would be better off if it had just a little bit more player aid support. That would go a long way to making the game better. You can obviously print these things off yourself, as I did, and that's not a big issue for me. But I think if you wanted to really make this a super product, that would be something you would need to do. The map itself is absolutely beautiful. I think I mentioned this when I did either my unboxing or my introduction video. It is really nice looking. I really like the look of it in general. It's got the nice wintry feel. The terrain itself is pretty easy to discern. There really weren't very many cases at all where I was looking at a hex and wondering what hex that is, what terrain is that supposed to be. It's all very clear. The road network, really does have an extremely strong influence on the gameplay. So it all comes together really well. Not really any curveballs. Maybe the only thing being the yellow lines that you maybe can't quite see on the camera feed here that separate the German army borders. Maybe could have been a little bit brighter or something to make it easier to see. It's not hard to see, but it might have been nicer to just have that stick out a little bit more. But really, ultimately, I really like the map. I just think it's just really great looking, and the gameplay works well with it, and there was really nothing oddball about that at all. It just all came together really well. So in talking about the actual game mechanics in a little bit more detail for a second, as I mentioned, the action chits are really what drives the game forward. Basically, you will have an initiative player, which is the Germans for the most part for the first half of the game, and then the allies in the second half of the game. They will get to pick one chit from the cup from what's available to just play. So there is a good amount of strategy for that player in determining what do they want to make sure they do right now before anything else happens, because they can't account for what happens later, but they can account for what happens right now. That decision is important, but then the rest of the chits just go out and you figure it out from there. The overall sort of breakdown of all of this is, and looking at the action chit summary, you have a basic move and combat chit. If you play it for movement, it means all of your units on the board, wherever they're at, can move up to their movement allowance. If you choose combat, that means everybody can conduct combat, assuming they are close enough to an enemy to do it. Now, there's some specialty stuff that comes into play for armor, where you can have armor do combat on a move if they didn't actually move at all. And for combat, armor can move 1 hex and still conduct combat. So there's a little bit of specialty stuff. Armor gets treated special. You also have a bunch of these specialty chits, like the All German or One Army chit, that allows certain units, depending on which chit you're talking about, do a move round and then a combat round, which is very powerful. So to be able to move and then immediately conduct the combat that you want is a huge advantage, a really powerful thing. In other cases, you might have movement and then your opponent gets to move, and then you don't get the nice combat you were hoping for. Or maybe your opponent gets combat and does a spoiling attack on you, so you can't quite get what you wanted. So you're always kind of playing through that. So these specialty chits tend to be just very powerful, and you need to figure out how are you going to use them to the most effect possible. You also have reinforcement chits. This brings units onto the board as reinforcements, so there is not a specific reinforcement phase of the turn. You pull these chits and those units come on the board. This means that you can't guarantee that your reinforcements will mean you can cover some critical road crossing just because they're coming in on turn 3 or 4 or whatever. It will tend to be you can't account for that. So it's, everything is open. You can't guarantee any of that. You can only do your best. The Germans also have to worry about a supply check. So the way supply works in this game, the Allies, you're basically always checking for supply when it matters. So if they need to move, if they are going to conduct combat or be attacked, you check their supply in the Allies or whatever state they are in. So you could have the Germans move, surround an Allied unit, then attack them later or in the same chit if it's a specialty chit, and that allied unit might be out of supply for that combat, and that has an impact on the combat itself. The Germans work a bit differently, where you only check their supply status when these chits are drawn, which may mean that in a real game context, you could have some German unit way out, behind enemy lines doing stuff, and as long as you don't pull that supply chit, they are treated as in supply for all other purposes, combat and all of that kind of stuff. But of course, the reverse becomes a challenge, that once you get a no supply marker, you're only going to get rid of it when the next supply check chit comes out of the cup. So it is interesting to see that difference and understanding what the Germans can try to get away with versus the Allies, which almost always have to be keeping in mind what their supply situation looks like. Are they supporting each other? Can a unit retreat without getting cut off from his buddies? All that kind of stuff. The Allies care a little bit more for. I mean, the Germans ultimately do too, but again, you have that opportunity as the Germans to make some risky moves if you think it's going to benefit you greatly. So all of that works together pretty well in the game itself. I'm going to zoom in for a second so you guys can see a little bit more. This is really the aftermath of my full campaign game. A lot of this stuff that you see on the board, it's all relatively straightforward hex and counter war game stuff. So you have the first number on a chit being its combat factors, the second number being movement. If a unit has three three values on the chit, the first is attack, second is defense, third is movement. And that kind of stuff I think is pretty bog standard for hex and counter war games. Units will tend to be multi-step. So if you take a step in combat, step loss as part of the combat results, you can flip a unit, and then it has its reverse side. In the game, you will have, in addition to flipped units, the Germans, specifically German armor units, will have 3 steps. So, as an example, we have this German armor unit. It has a front side valued at 6/6. If it takes a step loss, it's down to 3/6. And then if it were to take another loss, and we'll see how fast I can grab the appropriate third step, if it were to take another step loss, we would replace the counter with this third step here that has a 1 combat value, 6 movement, and it has a circled uh, combat factor, which means it does not project a ZOC, a zone of control. Um, so, the fact that you have 3 steps for some of these German units means there is some resiliency there compared to maybe other unit types, but they start to become a whole lot less effective once you lose those 2 steps. Uh, Generally, units do have zones of control, and they act just like you would expect in most hex and counter war games. They will cut enemy supply lines. They slow down the enemy entering them. They make it difficult to move because you can't move directly from an enemy ZOC into another enemy ZOC and that sort of thing. Um, and for the allies, they're really operating off of 2-step units across the whole board. So that 3-step benefit is something just really the Germans have access to. The overall flow of the game is ultimately about control of victory hexes on the map. There are several all over the place. New Chateau is one. Bastogne, which is covered up by units, is one. Houffalize is one. Saint-Vith is one. And then there's a whole bunch elsewhere. The whole game is really predicated on what the Germans can grab and hold on to for the duration of the game. So in the early phase of the game, they're executing their offensive, and so they're very likely trying to capture Saint-Vith. That provides a bunch of benefits if they can capture it quickly. They're also looking to get Houffalize and Bastogne. These areas very important because they serve as road junctions, like historically. They were important for that reason. They are also important in the game for that, both for the victory point purpose and just because it's easier to navigate the map if you control those spaces. And really, the Germans are trying to achieve victory by either getting 5 of these victory hexes during an end turn check, or potentially trying to get some armor on the other side of the Meuse River, which I found kind of difficult to achieve. Obviously, that didn't happen historically, so that's sort of the stretch victory condition for the Germans, something to try for if you can get it, because that was ultimately the objective of the campaign. But from the rest of the game perspective, when you realize you can't do it, then the Germans are hanging on just not to be pushed back to where they started at the beginning of the offensive at the West Wall all along here. So the Germans will be trying to push out. The Allies will eventually try to push them back, and that's basically the flow of the game. So I think in terms of the game mechanics, there's not much more I want to say there. There's a few other specialty things that come into play. You have things like engineering assets, which are placed in towns and villages, and they provide benefits to the allies on defense. Blowing up bridges is actually a pretty important part of the game, where you have these bridges. I'll zoom in for a second so you guys can see that a little bit better. You have these bridges at critical crossing points of rivers, and a defender can retreat across them and try to blow up the bridge, or you can deliberately move across the bridge and then blow up the bridge. That blowing of the bridge obviously makes it difficult for your opponent to attack across that river, to get across that river. It slows them down. And as historically it was just an element of the campaign, that is certainly here in full force in this game, especially because you can't trace a supply line over an unbridged river hex side. So, if you blow the bridges, the opponent can't necessarily just cross a river and be in supply. It remains a supply concern. So that is, I think, an important part of the gameplay is bridge management. The Germans are actually a little bit weakened here, where they can basically repair one bridge per army sector per turn. So in some cases, you might want to cross a river in multiple places and repair all of those bridges so that you're good to go for that whole front, but you literally cannot do that. You don't have enough engineering resources to repair all of those bridges, so you kind of have to pick one to be your critical, lifeline across that river. And so all of that becomes a strategic decision-making process as well, and it feels appropriate given the campaign itself. Um, yeah. I guess the only other thing I'd mention as part of just the gameplay is that this game works well in that both sides have an opportunity to be on the defensive and offensive, which is always fun. It's good to have a game where both players feel like they can get their punches in. Um, it did feel like the situation throughout my campaign could continue to evolve and swing in a direction if we played it right. So at one point we were getting close to be pushing up to the north part of the map as the Germans, but we couldn't quite make it. We almost took Luxembourg down in the south, but we couldn't quite do it. We almost broke through here, but we couldn't quite make it as the Germans. So there's all these situations that come up in active play where you just get that feeling, if I could just do a little bit more, if I could do this combat, if I could get this result, I might just blow open the whole game. Um, and that is going on for a lot of the game, the whole game really, as the players are trying to figure out how the end state is going to come up. And it just tended to be a very enjoyable game experience overall. There's other things to consider. There's airborne units that have certain considerations for them. There are infantry units. There are the armory units. There's mechanized units. Uh, and all of it just comes together, I think, really well for what is basically a more lighter or medium weight war game covering Battle of the Bulge that fits on one map as opposed to a big two-mapper game or a really big complicated game. I found it to be a worthwhile experience, a game that wasn't terribly difficult to learn. So I'm probably going to repeat myself a little bit here in the conclusion of this video, but in terms of understanding the game mechanics, I think folks will understand how all of this works and at least can see what all the different game elements are. I suppose there's one other thing I should call out. It would be a mistake to gloss over this. The roads do enable you to perform motorized movement. The Allies can do this whenever any of their units starts on a road. The Germans are a little more restricted, where they tend to only be able to do it when a unit first comes onto the map. But they do have a special marker that allows one unit per turn to operate in a motorized fashion. And what this means is if you're traveling along a road, you're paying half a movement point for each hex along that road. So basically 2 hexes for each movement point, even through more difficult terrain. And so what this means is like an armor unit with a 6 movement factor could potentially be moving 12 hexes. And so you really do have the potential to be zooming through these road networks, depending on if you're not dealing with enemy Zocs or enemy units, or you fear being cut out of supply. But there are some restrictions on how you use that, and I think it does a really good job of putting importance on covering these road junctions. But that motorized movement rule and the restrictions on it are something very, very important to review. And what you have to be aware of is a really critically important part of it is if a unit is doing that, and let's say zooming, moving motorized movement through here, the unit could not, for instance, just to set up a scenario here, this unit here could not go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because this guy clogs up the road. So traffic is actually a game mechanic that matters. And so if you were doing a movement, what you'd want to do is probably move this guy out of the way first, and then this unit can zoom, zoom, zoom. And you can even, if you have enough movement points, if it were to be 1 movement point to move into here, this unit actually could, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If he was here, move, 1 movement point, 2 movement point, 3 movement point, 4, 4.5, and then 5.5. But this would be a whole movement point to move from here to here to join that unit. So you can combine, but motorized movement, if you're going to use it, has to be at the start of that unit's movement phase. So, or that movement action. So you have to start on a road and you have to keep in mind traffic. And it could be that you run out of movement points before you could join your buddy in the next hex up. So there's a certain amount of management when it comes to that. And even in the early game, there are specific asset markers that are used by both players to make hexes more expensive to move through as a way of simulating the traffic issues that both the traffic issues and other things like Operation Greif that impacted the campaign. So that is another interesting set of sort of special rules or capabilities that the players have that really impact movement on the map. So when there is that active movement phase of the game, all of that has to be a major consideration. So overall, I mean, when you're actually playing the game, you are balancing a whole lot of interesting factors, right? You're dealing with the chit pool. You're dealing with the normal combat, figuring out factors and who can attack where and step losses. You're worried about the rivers and supply lines and blown bridges, and you're worried about traffic jams and can the units get to where they need to be, or are you too clogged up in a specific area? And it all comes together in a really satisfying way. So, we'll talk more about that here in the conclusion section, which I'll kick it over to right now. Okay, so what did I think of the game? Well, this is a pretty easy review video to do. I really liked it. I really liked it. It was a lot of fun to play through. Now, as a fan of the series before this, I kind of knew going in I would probably enjoy myself, and I did. I think the game package works pretty well. The only things that I will say, and I said it earlier in the video, if you watch the middle part, um, there could be some improvements made to the components just in terms of the player aid chart support. Um, one additional player aid sheet with some stuff on either side related to the special turn reminders and the additional combat shift effects would go a long way to making this an even better package than it already is. If it had those additional player aid sheets, this would be up there for me at like a 9 out of 10. I mean, that and high praise, but I think it's definitely in that zone. Without that just being in the game package, the gameplay might be up in that range, but the product itself maybe more like an 8.5 or a strong 8.5. Because it's just so close to being even better than it is, just lacking some of those additional player aid sheets out of the box. You kind of have to go make that yourself or download something off Board Game Geek. That's something you can easily do, but you maybe shouldn't necessarily have to. The special rules that govern the first several turns of the game may be a lot for folks. For me, it wasn't a big deal. I'm used to those special rules. The Dark Valley had them. The Dark Sands had them. Other games have special rules. That's just a thing that happens. Here, there are enough of them that you really kind of have to navigate those special turn rules earlier in the game. Early in the game, and you might not enjoy that. That might be a thing that will aggravate some people, or maybe will be an annoyance that might hurt someone's ability to enjoy the game. But for me, it wasn't a huge deal. It really wasn't that much to even really worry about. And because these special rules make sense as to why they exist, they tend to be easier to remember, or at least are easier to accept as part of the gameplay experience. It wasn't so bad. But that is one thing, as a caution, I would say to folks is, evaluate those special rules and understand there are going to be some before the game gets to the later phases where those start to drop off. But really, I had a really good time with the game, with that as a part of it. The special rules kind of steer the game in a certain direction. I don't think it's overly railroading, but it is allowing for the historical situation to play out. And with a lot of these games, operational games in general, even more so than just the Dark and Deadly series, that you don't get to decide things that are outside the boundaries of the map. You are not making grand strategic decisions. You are making very operational decisions for this campaign. So you are navigating those constraints. Those things are constraints for you. You're not playing World in Flames, where you could decide to build, extra air power or something to make a difference. You are operating within the ability of the Germans and the Americans, the Allies, in this given time frame for this given campaign. The chits are designed to work through that, and everything else in the game are operating in that boundary of what you're capable of doing. But obviously, in my game experience, technically it was a German victory for my campaign that I had played, that being due to them holding out against the Allied counteroffensive. So obviously things can happen that are not historical, or you can end up with a different game state at the end. The game still allows enough of the player decision and the randomness of the chit draws and the dice to have the experience that you have in the game be authentic, but not be predetermined. You could have a breakout victory where the Germans win early. You could have, a situation where the Allies do very, very well and the Germans are just shut down early, right? All of that is possible, and it's up to the players to navigate that, to play through that, and see what happens. It's a game. You will play it. You will have an experience. For me, it just served as a really good Bulge game. I know there's a question around how many Bulge games are out there. Do you need another one? I can't answer that question for you. If you have a Battle of the Bulge game that you really like already, I don't know that there's something here that will necessarily draw you away from a game that you already like. If you really like chit pool, or you prefer chit pool, then this might be a reason to specifically get this game, because you get the Battle of the Bulge in a chit pool context, and that can be a lot of fun, right? If you really like chit pool, I know I do. But if you have other games and you really, really like them, and they're already just the best Battle of the Bulge game you can imagine, well, then this might not be for you, just because maybe you've already found your Battle of the Bulge game. You already have it. There's nowhere else to go. But for me, I didn't really have a big trunk of Battle of the Bulge games to really try to compare this to as much. I could look at this game in a vacuum as just what can this game offer? Does it provide a compelling gameplay experience for the Battle of the Bulge? And for me, it absolutely did. I mean, it really is a lot of fun. If future printings can make the enhancements that I mentioned, then this would be a for sure recommended game to anybody who's looking for a Bulge game and doesn't already have one. Even as it is right now, without those improvements, I still think this is a great game for someone who doesn't already have a Bulge game or looking for something a little bit different. If you've been enticed by this chit pool series from Ted Raicer, that to me this is a no-brainer, right? But if you've got 5 other Bulge games on your shelf, okay, maybe you don't get this one, but I think Revolution Games did a really good job with this. I think the setup map, while being a little unconventional, was a success. I think the boxed edition is good. If you're going to pick, I mean, I like having a box. You could get away with the folio edition if you wanted to go a little bit of a cheaper route. But I think Revolution did a really good job. I don't have a lot of Revolution Games products. I have like one other one. I think it's Fury at Midway. So this was my first real boxed game. I think all the component quality, it was pretty rock solid. In terms of the actual content of the material, it was all good. The only improvement area would be a color rulebook, but even that I didn't feel was really needed because the player aid charts are pretty good, and everything else pops with a lot of nice color and theme, and everything comes together really, really well. So this might not be surprising to folks watching this video. You probably assumed, if you're familiar with me in terms of my game experience with the series, I would probably like it. And I like this game. I recommend it, in fact. So if you're looking for an extension of the Chit Pull series by Ted Raicer, by whatever name or branding you might need to see, I think this is a surefire win. If you're looking for a bulge game and you don't already have one that you really like, I think this one is worthwhile to look at, both from a solitaire perspective and also a opposed perspective. If you got a buddy who wants to play a bulge game with you, the game is probably about 12 hours in campaign length, and it's not necessarily 1 hour per turn. It will sort of be that way. You might be over an hour for each turn at the beginning, and then the final turns of the game will go by much more quickly because it'll be clear what you need to try to do. But it still comes out to be about 12 hours, which means you could play it over a weekend of solid 6 hour gaming time frames. You can knock it out in one big day if you're playing for 12 whole hours. You might even be able to get it knocked out in a single day because maybe someone wins an early victory or something. But it makes for a really good game day a game. If you just want to set something up, it sets up pretty quickly. It plays pretty quickly. It just works really well for that. You can set it up, package it back up, all in a relatively quick time frame. And so it works really well. I think until I play the Dark Summer, this would be the smallest, quickest playing game in the series. The Dark Summer might end up being shorter because it's only 10 turns. I'll have to see how that game plays, which we'll look at soon. But I think this works really well if someone's not too sure about the Dark Valley or the Dark Sands, which are a little bit bigger games. This is a smaller one, and it plays well. And I mean, what more can you ask of a war game, right? It plays well. You can get it out, have a good time with it, put it back. It's not a big monster game, but it gives you a good game experience for the time spent for sure. So yeah, get this one, guys. It was a good experience. I'm looking forward to seeing what else Revolution Games does in terms of the Deadly series. There will probably be more, and whether you're buying a game from GMT or Revolution Games, Ted Raicer tends to make some pretty good games, and this Chit Pull series has been a winner for me every game in the series. So I'm really looking forward to the future, whatever may be coming. It's just all goodness from here on out. Hopefully we don't ever have a dud. But so far so good, right? All right. Well, I think that'll do it for this video, guys. Thanks for watching. I appreciate the interaction with folks who watched the series sort of play out. Thank you to those who pointed out my rules mistakes. It happens. I hope this video was valuable to you and can help make you decide if you want to get the game or not. And if you do, great. If not, hey, it may not be for everybody. The important thing is you have an opportunity to see what the game is like, and I hope I did that for you. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you appreciate the video. Hit like if you like the video. If you want to see more, you can always subscribe and see what else I'll be covering in my deep analysis and deep coverage video series for games. And until next time, take care and keep on gaming.